August 17, 1943, Regensburg, Germany. Dawn broke pale and uncertain over the flat fields of eastern England. At RAF bases in Norfolk and Suffolk, the air was already heavy with the smell of fuel and oil. Ground crews had been awake for hours. So had the men who would soon climb into the aluminum hulls of Boeing B-17 flying fortresses, aircraft the German intelligence still publicly dismissed as slow, predictable, and fatally vulnerable without fighter cover. The date mattered. By mid-August 1943, the air war over Europe had reached a point of decision. The United States Air Forces were committed to daylight precision bombing, a doctrine built on faith in formation flying, overlapping defensive fire, and the belief that massed heavy bombers could fight their way through enemy airspace. The Germans did not share that belief. Neither, increasingly, did many of the men who flew the missions. On this morning, the 8th Air Force was preparing one of its deepest and most dangerous penetrations yet into the German Reich. The target was Regensburg, specifically the Messerschmitt Bf 109 assembly plants. The Bf 109 was the backbone of the Luftwaffe's single-engine fighter force. Every completed airframe meant another German pilot in the sky, another interception over occupied Europe, another threat to Allied bombers. Destroying those factories mattered. The plan, on paper, was bold and complex. 2 bomber forces would strike on the same day. One would hit Regensburg, then continue south, across the Alps, to land in North Africa. The second would attack Schweinfurt, home of Germany's ball-bearing industry, and return to England. The timing was intended to split German defenses and overwhelm the Luftwaffe's command and control. But there was a problem that could not be planned away. American fighter escorts did not yet have the range to protect bombers all the way to the target and beyond. The P-47 Thunderbolt, sturdy and heavily armed, could escort the formations part of the way. So could the Spitfires operating from English bases. But over Germany itself, beyond a certain line on the map, the bombers would be alone. Past that line, the sky belonged to the Luftwaffe. The Germans knew it. They had studied American escort patterns carefully. They tracked fuel limitations, turning points, and altitude changes. Luftwaffe pilots joked openly about the moment when the escorts peeled away and the bombers continued on, exposed and vulnerable. It was there, over central Germany, that most losses occurred. Shortly after sunrise, the first B-17s began to roll. Each aircraft weighed over 65,000 pounds fully loaded. Each carried a crew of 10, pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, engineer/top turret gunner, radio operator, ball turret gunner, 2 waist gunners, and a tail gunner. Between them, they manned up to 13.50 caliber machine guns, firing heavy armor-piercing rounds. The B-17 was designed to absorb punishment. It was not designed to fly without protection deep into enemy territory. The men climbed aboard, knowing exactly where they would be alone. Weather delayed the takeoff schedule. That delay mattered more than anyone realized at the time. It disrupted the carefully calculated timing between the Regensburg and Schweinfurt forces. By the time the first formations crossed the English coast, the separation between the 2 attacks was widening. Over the North Sea, the formations assembled at altitude. Contrails stretched across the sky like chalk lines. The bombers climbed to between 25,000 and 27,000 feet, where the air was thin, the temperature hovered near -40 degrees Fahrenheit, and oxygen masks were not optional but essential. Frost crept along metal surfaces inside the aircraft. Oil congealed in exposed lines. Men stamped their feet to keep blood moving. German radar stations detected them almost immediately. By the time the bombers crossed the Dutch coast, the Luftwaffe was already vectoring fighter units into position. Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf FW 190s climbed to intercept altitude. Some carried underwing cannon pods designed specifically to break up bomber formations. Others were armed with rockets intended to be fired from outside the effective range of the B-17's guns. The American escorts stayed with the bombers as long as they could. Then, one by one, they turned back. There was no ceremony to it, no signal flare, just a gradual thinning of friendly fighters until the bombers were alone against an enemy who prepared for exactly this moment. Inside the B-17s, crews felt a change immediately. The radio chatter shifted. Gunners scanned the empty sky with greater intensity. Pilots tightened formation spacing, knowing that cohesion was survival. The defensive firepower of a single B-17 was limited. The defensive firepower of a tight combat box was something else entirely. The Germans attacked in waves. They came head-on first, exploiting the narrow frontal profile of the bomber and the limited arcs of its nose guns. Closing speeds exceeded 400 miles per hour. Pilots held their courses steady, while bombardiers and nose gunners fired short, controlled bursts. The sky filled with vapor trails, cannon flashes, and sudden violent explosions as 20mm shells struck aluminum skin. Some bombers fell out of formation almost immediately. A hit to an engine could be fatal over Germany. A hit to the oxygen system could incapacitate a crew in seconds. A hit to the cockpit could kill both pilots at once. The German fighters pressed their attacks with discipline, breaking away cleanly and reforming for another pass. Yet the formations held. The B-17s absorbed damage that would have destroyed lighter aircraft. Wings were torn open, control surfaces shredded, engines burned and were feathered. Still, the bombers flew on, holding altitude, holding course. By the time the Regensburg force reached the target, losses had already been taken. The bomb run was brief and exacting. Bomb bay doors opened. The aircraft flew straight and level for long exposed seconds, while flak bursts rose to meet them. Black clouds of steel fragments timed to explode at bomber altitude. The factories below were clearly visible, so were the defensive gun positions around them. At the release point, bombs fell. Then the bombers turned south. This was the moment that defined the mission. Instead of turning back toward England, the Regensburg force continued deeper into enemy territory. They crossed Austria. They crossed the Alps. There would be no fighter escort ahead of them. There would be no friendly territory beneath them for hundreds of miles. Fuel consumption was critical. Navigation errors could be fatal. The Germans had not expected this. Luftwaffe fighter units scrambled to pursue, but range and fuel limitations worked against them now. Attacks continued, but they thinned with distance. Over the mountains, turbulence shook damaged aircraft violently. Oxygen systems struggled at altitude. Wounded men were tended as best they could in freezing conditions. Some aircraft diverted, some force-landed, some were lost. But a core group remained together. They flew on, alone, beyond the reach of the German fighter fields that had been built to defend the Reich's heartland. When they finally descended toward airfields in North Africa, after more than 11 hours in the air, the crews were exhausted, dehydrated, and in shock. Many aircraft were barely flyable, yet they had made it. German radio propaganda had long mocked the idea that American bombers could survive without escort. German fighter pilots had laughed at the claim that heavy bombers could protect themselves. On this day, reality complicated that confidence. Not all returned. Losses were heavy, but the doctrine had not collapsed, and the men who had flown that mission understood something essential. The B-17 was not invulnerable, but it was not helpless either. The cost, however, was becoming impossible to ignore.